Well, I got to tell you, I'm excited to be in this book. I've been reading Esther for months now, and it's a short book. It's only 10 chapters, so you can easily get through it in one sitting. So the thing about Esther is it's a really gripping story, and it's an intensely dark story at the same time. There's sex, there's violence woven throughout the book, there's crisis, there's genocidal hatred in the book. Excuse me, I'm still getting over a cold, so you'll have to forgive me if I cough in your ear. It's just the worst possible timing, but sorry. So most people, when you've read the book of Esther, and perhaps you've read Esther before, it's sort of sometimes we can approach Esther like it's this Cinderella story about courage and beauty and standing up for what's right. And of course, that's all part of the book of Esther. But there's so much more in the book of Esther that we often don't understand or realize as we look at this story. There's these deep theological layers that are woven throughout this book that's important for us to understand. And so I'm hoping through this series we'll learn some of those things. We'll learn how Esther is ultimately pointing us and foreshadowing forward to us to Jesus. So now it's important to remember as we look at Esther, as we do any book in the Bible, Esther's not the hero of the story. Esther's not the hero of the story. God is the hero of the story. And so people often miss that, and we miss the fact that God is working behind the scenes, and we think that it's this story, and somehow God is absent from the story. God is at work within this book entirely. So it's an incredible book. Now, a couple things you may not realize about the book of Esther that makes it somewhat unique in the books of the Bible. The name of God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. There is no word from God. There's no word spoken to God. Prayer is never described. Worship is never mentioned. This book is a bigger story. It's a bigger story. It's pointing us forward, and it's pointing us to see that God is in every part of the story, and it's foreshadowing and pointing us forward to the gospel of Jesus Christ. So there's four main characters in this book. There's two Hebrew characters. That's Esther, the main who the book is named after, and then her uncle Mordecai. And then there's two Persians in this book as well, and their names are Haman and King Ahasuerus. So now, one thing that can be a bit confusing is that sometimes the Bible describes people's names from a Hebrew perspective and sometimes from a Greek perspective. And when we talk about King Ahasuerus, kind of a mouthful, when it's labeled, when his name is referred to in that fashion, that's the Hebrew name for his name. A more familiar name, the same person, is King Xerxes. That's his Greek name. So that's why it can be a bit confusing. So we're talking, if I say King Xerxes, because it's easier to say, I'm talking about the same guy. It's the same guy, it's the same king, it's just a Hebrew name for him and a Greek name for him. And so don't be confused by that. It's the same person. He is the Persian king. And then we have Haman, who is this kind of wicked man who plots to kill the people, in the Jewish people in the book. So those are the four main characters to keep in mind as we look at this series together. So we titled this series The Queen's Gambit. Any chess players here? This might maybe make more sense to you if you know chess, but The Queen's Gambit is a great title for the book of Esther. And it's one of the Queen's Gambit is one of the oldest and most famous chess openings. That's what the Queen's Gambit means. It's an opening in chess. So basically, a player opens the game by sacrificing a pawn early in the game that's close to the queen, usually to the left of the queen. And what it seems like is that person has opened up the possibility for the queen to be taken, but it looks like a mistake in the opening. But it's not a mistake at all. It's actually part of the strategy. So it's very strategic. By sacrificing something small like a pawn, you're opening the queen up, and actually the queen then has the opportunity to gain control of the center of the board because the queen gets out early. So it's a small sacrifice for a long-term victory. That's what the Queen's Gambit is in the game of chess. So it's a planned loss for greater positioning. A planned loss for greater positioning. It's a sacrifice for the greater good. So now the opponent that's playing against the chess master who opens up the game with the Queen's Gambit might look at that and say, hey, I'm going to take advantage of that. There's an opening here. In fact, they might even see it as a mistake and they'll think that they have the upper hand. But the chess master sits back, is calm, is strategic, knows I planned this the whole time. This is all part of it. There's a focus because that chess master is not thinking about the loss of that pawn. That chess master is thinking about 10 moves ahead. So even when a key piece is taken, the chess master doesn't panic. He doesn't lose sight of the big picture because every move is part of the bigger story. So it's less about winning a move, and it's more about winning the game. All right, this is exactly what Esther is all about. So Queen's Gambit is a fitting title for this series. Now, at first glance, when you look at the book of Esther, and if you've read through it, you might look at the book of Esther and think to yourself, God's not even in the game. God's not even in the game. The book opens up, as Mark read, about this pagan, wicked Persian king throwing this huge drunken party. All right, this is what Esther 1 is all about, and we'll look at it more next week as well. But so later, Esther, a Jewish girl, is literally taken and put into the king's harem. So essentially, Esther is taken because she's beautiful, and the king takes her and puts her into his harem, which basically means that she is like a sex slave. And so the story continues, and you watch this evil man, Haman, and Haman rises to power within the kingdom of this wicked King Xerxes or Ahasuerus, and he plots genocide against the Jewish people in the kingdom of Persia. Now, it's a chess match, okay? So I want you to see this. It looks like the enemy is winning. It looks like that. But what we soon discover is this, is that God is the unseen chess master in the story who looks over the board and is always 10 steps ahead. So God, as we will see throughout this story, allows Vashti, who is the current queen of Persia, allows her to be removed, and then God positions Esther in that very spot. God places Mordecai, Esther's uncle, at the king's gate at just the right time, and causes the king at just the right time to have a sleepless night and to be just there at just the right time. So we see God moving and turning the enemy's strategy against himself. So think of it like this grand master who sacrifices the queen to win in the end. So God's positioning his people for something greater. Every move looks random. When you read this book, it looks random. And then you zoom out and you realize that the chess master is actually part of every part of this story. Where it seems like God is losing, and then you step back and you zoom out and you realize, actually, God never lost. God's been in control the entire time. Now, here's a one-sentence summary of the book of Esther for you. Through God's providence and in keeping with his promises, God places Esther and Mordecai in positions of power to preserve his people and punish his enemies. To preserve his people and punish his enemies. So who is in control? God is. God is in control. We call this God's sovereignty. God is sovereign. He is in control of all things. So God's sovereignty means that he has ultimate power and authority over all things. Nothing happens outside of God's control. He rules over his creation absolutely and eternally. A couple of verses here that describe how God's sovereignty is about who's in charge. So we never need to doubt who's in charge. God is always in charge because God is sovereign. Okay, so Psalm 115:3. Our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. He's in control of all things. Psalm 103:19. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom rules over all. Now, there are many passages throughout the Bible that we could turn to recognize the sovereignty of God. He is in control of all things. Now, sometimes when we talk about sovereignty, we use the word providence. You say the providence of God. Now, they're not exactly the same thing. They're not interchangeable in the way that we often think of it. So God's providence is his activity of how he works out his sovereignty. Okay, so you could say God's providence is how he works out his sovereign will in the world, often behind the scenes through ordinary means. It's God working out his sovereignty. So God's providence is him at work in the everyday, mundane pieces of our lives. He's like the chess master moving the pieces around the board. Providence is what you could say is his sovereignty in action. Providence is God's sovereignty in action. Guiding events, directing people, opening and closing doors, and working even through human choices to accomplish his plan. That's the providence of God. So God rules through his providence. So God is always at work. Again, many places we could look at this, okay? Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good who love him. Or Genesis 50, verse 20, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. This is talking about the story of Joseph and all these situations that happened for Joseph to become next to the king in Egypt. So he's very powerful, and all these things had to happen. That's the providence of God working out his sovereignty in control of all things. So we want to make that distinction. So God is sovereign, and his providence is his sovereignty in action. So think of it, if we want to go back to the chessboard, think of it like this. The chessboard and the grandmaster chess player. So sovereignty means he is the reigning champion. He's in full control of the board, and he's in full control of the outcome. Providence is how he plays every move. He's guiding the game skillfully, moving the pawns and the players around the board, even using the opponent's move to win the match, like the Queen's Gambit. So in Esther, what we see is we, of course, see God's sovereignty. He is in control of all things. He rules over kings, he rules over kingdoms and empires and timelines. But we also see the providence of God at work because God uses things that we don't think about, mundane things of life like feasts and beauty contests and sleepless nights and coincidences to save his people, even though throughout the book of Esther, God's name is never mentioned. Crazy. So God's providential fingerprints are all over the book of Esther throughout the entire story. Proverbs 21:1 says this, the king's heart is in the hand of the Lord. He directs it like a watercourse wherever he pleases. Again, Romans 8:28, in all things God works for the good. God is at work behind all things, even when we don't understand it. So Esther reminds us that God is not just watching the board, he's guiding the game. He's not just watching the board, he's guiding the game. Even in this wicked cultural setting that we find the book of Esther taking place in, even through flawed people, even in silence, God is at work. And if he can do that in Esther's life, he can do that in yours. Don't you find that it's easy to look at the world and think to yourself, where is God? Where is God? Where is God in the chaos of our culture? Where is God in perhaps the uncertainty of your marriage? Or where is God with my kids? Or where is God in the affairs of our day and what's going on and the confusion that we experience? Where is God? We have those questions over and over and over in our lives. He doesn't need to be loud to be present. The story of Esther proves he never stops keeping his promises. He never stops keeping his promise. He's always at work, and the providential fingerprints of God is all over our lives, even when we can't see it. So, this morning's passage, we're going to look sort of as an intro to the book this morning. This morning's first 9 verses are sort of the red carpet introduction to this divine drama that God is going to work out through this wicked Persian king's party. All right, so let's jump into the text a little bit here. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. Let me just pause there, because I want to take us back a little bit, and I want to take us on a little bit of a journey, if you're okay with that, because the journey is going to help us understand the context of the book of Esther. How did the Jewish people get to be part of this wicked Persian empire? Sometimes when we look at the Bible, we think to ourselves, that book just was dropped there out of nowhere. And a book like Esther can feel that way, but like all books of the Bible, they're rooted in history. They're not just dropped there out of nowhere and have no context anywhere else in the Bible. The books of the Bible are all interweaved together, and it's helpful for us to understand how Esther fits into the grand narrative of what God's doing. And you're going to see the providential hand of God moving this and moving that to help us understand the context for the book of Esther. Okay, so we ready for this journey? Good. Okay. So let's go back to the people of God, the story of the Exodus. We know the story. I won't go over the story of the Exodus because we walked through that. But I want you to see how God's people became under the hand of this Persian King Xerxes. There's quite a bit of a backstory here that we need to understand about this book. So when the people of Israel left Egypt after 400 years of slavery, Moses led them out. We know the story. We're familiar with the story. We preached and taught about this story. Eventually, the mantle of leadership went from Moses to Joshua, and it was Joshua who led the people of God, the Israelites, into the promised land, the land of Canaan, and it was God's promised land for his people, and they were to be a nation there. They were to worship God there, and they were to thrive in that place. Well, when the people got to the land of Canaan, they began to look around at the nations that were all around them. And they began to realize there was something different about themselves and the nations that were around them. And what they realized is that the nations around them were ruled by kings. Each nation around them had a king. And so God's people at that time lived under what's called a theocracy. So a theocracy is a form of government which means that God is the king. They didn't have a human king. They had God was their king. That's what God wanted for them. God wanted to be their king, and he wanted them to be his people. And so God was their king. And so they looked around and they saw all these other nations. And what we know and we can count on with the Israelites is that they're very stubborn people. And they looked around at the other nations and they thought to themselves, you know what? We want a king like the other nations. We want to look like the other nations. And God's heart is like, no, I don't want you to look like the other nations. I want you to be a holy people, a distinct people, that you look different, that when the other nations look at you, they say, oh, wow, look at that. Look at them worship God. And God is their king. But the stubborn Israelites, they pleaded with God, and they said to God, we want a king for ourselves. In 1 Samuel 8:5, it says this, now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the other nations. Imagine this. All right, they've left Egypt. God has done all these amazing miracles. He's brought them into the land he's promised. He's cared for them. He's watched over them. And they turn their back and they say, actually, you're not king enough for us. We want a king like the other nations have. And they're rejecting God's unique leadership over them as a king. So God responds to Samuel, who is the prophet. A prophet just means that God speaks through this individual. This individual speaks on behalf of God to the people. And so God speaks to Samuel in 1 Samuel 8:7, and he says this, they have not rejected you, Samuel, but they have rejected me from being king over them. So God saw this not as a request for leadership. God saw this and knew the heart of the people. This was actually a rejection of God as king. It was a rejection of God's leadership. It was a rejection of all that God had done for his people. Now in verses 10 to 18 in 1 Samuel, God tells Samuel to warn the people. He says, I know you want a king to look like the other nations, but I need to tell you it's not a good idea. This is not a good idea. And when you have an earthly king, that earthly king is going to hurt you as a nation. And he's going to take your sons, and they're going to be a part of his army. And he's going to take your daughters for his palace. And he's going to tax your land. And he will do it all for his own gain. And God's warning the people. And eventually, he says, you shall cry out because of your king, because of your stubborn hearts, because you wanted this king, you're going to cry out, but the Lord will not answer you because you've been disobedient. So this warning is very clear. Do not take a king like the other nations have, because that king will rule only for themselves and not for you. And the nation of Israel, despite these warnings, they still wanted a king, and God gave them what they wanted, knowing that it would ultimately hurt the people. 1 Samuel 8:19-20. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like the other nations." So once again, the people of Israel looked to other nations to be like other nations rather than to be obedient to God. They ignored the voice of God, and there was consequences to this. So they went from a theocracy to a monarchy. Now they're being ruled by an earthly king. And early in the Jewish monarchy, there was three kings. First it was Saul, he was the first king. Then there was David, and then there was Solomon. Figures that we all have heard if you're familiar with the Bible. So it was actually Solomon who took David's plans for the temple, and it was Solomon who actually built the temple, which we'll come back to later on in Esther. Now, because King Solomon during his life was unfaithful, and he would take on all these foreign wives, eventually, because of his unfaithfulness, he would be worshiping, and he'd give himself over to the worship of these foreign wives. So you begin to see now the downfall of the nation of Israel. And so Solomon's taking on these wives, he's worshiping these foreign gods, and he's lost sight of the fact that God is actually the king, and he's doing these kinds of things. So God warned Solomon and told him in 1 Kings 11:11, because of your disobedience, this will be the downfall of your kingdom. This will be the downfall of your kingdom. But he said, I'm not going to cause the downfall of your kingdom while you're still alive because I want to honor the faithfulness of David. But when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam takes over. And Rehoboam is an absolute mess. And during his reign, what happens to the nation of Israel is it splits into two nations. This is part of why it can be a bit confusing when we read the Bible. So the kingdom was divided now. And you had a northern kingdom. All right, this is called Israel. And this was made up of 10 of the 12 tribes. So 10 tribes made up the northern kingdom, Israel. And then there was the southern kingdom called Judah. And there was two tribes. It was Judah and Benjamin of the 12 tribes of Israel that left Egypt. So now the kingdom is divided. And it's a mess. And Rehoboam is an absolute mess of a king. And the people are in disobedience, and they're in division, and they're sort of against each other, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and things start to fall apart pretty quickly. But even in this, you see this nightmare of this King Rehoboam. You see that God is working even in this situation. And it's through the line of Judah, the tribe of Judah in the southern kingdom, which would ultimately lead to Jesus, who is the true king. Now, both the north and the south kingdoms had kings, right? The northern kingdom, however, had no good kings. They were all an absolute mess. And basically, the northern kingdom went into a free fall collapse. And in 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire comes in and takes over and destroys the northern kingdom and takes Israel and takes the Israel women, the Jewish women, and they intermarried, they forcefully intermarried the Assyrian men with the Jewish women. And they did this in the city of Samaria primarily. And when the Jewish women gave birth to these babies that they had with these Syrian men, they were called Samaritans. Now, you might know when you read the scripture that, especially in the New Testament, the Jewish people had nothing good to say about Samaritans because Samaritans were considered half-breeds because the Jewish women were forced to marry and have kids with the Assyrian men, and their kids were now called Samaritans. So, when you read the story of Jesus talking about the Good Samaritan, to a Jewish ear, there was no such thing. There was no such thing as a good Samaritan. In fact, Samaritans were like dogs. They were considered like dogs, like mutts. And so the Samaritans came from the northern kingdom, and it was completely destroyed, and the Jewish women were intermarrying and being forcefully married into these relationships with Assyrians. They were worshiping the Assyrian gods. The northern kingdom, okay, after I say all that, just know this, the northern kingdom was a mess. It was a mess. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah had a few good kings, but in 586, the Babylonian Empire invades and takes key people, skilled people. They didn't take everyone back to Babylon. They invaded, they took over the southern kingdom. But what they did is they took the kind of the best of the best. They took, the intellectuals, they took the musicians, they took all the people that they thought would help them in their own kingdom, and they took them back to Babylon with them. Now, you might remember a particular book, the book of Daniel. And Daniel is one of these men that was taken from the southern kingdom back to Babylon. And Daniel was kind of known as a bit of a sage, and the king would call on him to interpret his dream. And so I want you to see this, the providence of God. He's moving the pieces around the board. Right? Daniel is now taken from the southern kingdom, and he's now being used to interpret the king's dreams, King Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel says this to the king. Okay, here's what your dream means, king. God is showing you all the empires that are going to rise and are going to fall over the next 100 years. And so starting with the Babylonian Empire, then the Medes, or the Media, this is not CTV, this is the Medes, the Mede Empire. The Medes and the Persian Empire, then the Greeks, then the Romans. So centuries before they were even things on the earth, God is calling the shots through this dream. So sure enough, in 538 BC, the Babylonian Empire is defeated by the Medes and the Persians. They come in, they take over the Babylonian Empire essentially without a fight. And the Persians, more or less, they tag team this. So the Medes and the Persians, they tag team this. They take over the Babylonian Empire. And then the Persians more or less swallow up the Medes. So that's why in history it's referred to as the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire began with a tag team between the Medes and the Persians, and the Persians won out. Now the first king of this newly minted Persian Empire is a guy by the name of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great is how he's been known throughout history. The Persian Empire was an absolute dominant military force at that time, and it rose to power. It ended up ruling for 200 years. And so they have this huge empire. They're defeating the Babylons. Let me show you a map here. You can see. So that pink part of that map is the Persian Empire at the time of Esther. So you can understand how much land mass the Persian Empire held. So you couldn't escape. Like if you were there, you couldn't just jump across the border unless you live near the border. It was very difficult to escape this. So now this nation, this Persian Empire, was made up of all kinds of nations, all kinds of people that were swallowed up through victory after victory. And so you had all kinds of gods that were being worshipped, and all kinds of different people groups making their life in the Persian Empire now. Now God's hand's all over this. Okay, so after the Israelites were taken captive, the Lord speaks to another prophet, a prophet by the name of Jeremiah. Once they're taken by the Babylonians, God speaks through Jeremiah, and he says through Jeremiah to the people, he says, yes, you're being taken captive, but you will be taken captive only for 70 years. 70 years. Let me read you this. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. God's going to bring them back to Jerusalem. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So God tells them, essentially, you've been taken captive. And while you're taken captive, plant your gardens, live your lives, build your homes, marry, have your kids get married. And after 70 years, I'm going to return you to your land. I'm going to return you to Jerusalem, and you're going to rebuild. Verse 12, then you will call upon me and come and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me. And when you seek me with all your heart, I will be found by you, declares the Lord. And I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all the places where I've driven you, declares the Lord. And I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. This is, again, the hand of providence. It's God's way of working out the story that we're about to enter into in the book of Esther. After 70 years of captivity, God stirs Cyrus the Great's heart. Now, this is crazy. Think about this, the power of God. He stirs his heart, this first king of the Persian Empire, and he stirs his heart to let God's people go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. 70 years after God promised that this would happen, it happens as God stirs Cyrus's heart. In Ezra chapter 1, 1-4, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he might make a proclamation throughout his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heavens, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, whoever is among you, whoever is God's people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. Verse 4, and let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Think about this. God has worked in the heart of Cyrus to send the people of Israel back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple and to send them with everything they need, from gold to priceless things and silver and goods and everything that they would need. This is remarkable, what God is doing. Now, this is where it takes a bit of a turn. The book of Ezra, just for some context, the book of Ezra is all about the rebuilding of a people that have been in captivity. That's basically what Esther's all about. What does it mean to be a nation under God? What does it look like to be God's people? And they return to Jerusalem and they begin to rebuild the temple. And as they're rebuilding the temple, the rebuilding stops because what happens is the people get really comfortable with living their lives. And they say, the temple can wait. I need to build my house. I need to plant my vineyards. I need to have my gardens. So we'll just set the temple aside for now. And they're being disobedient to God because God's called them back to rebuild the temple. And they say, well, we'll do it later. Haggai and Zechariah are all about, these are books in the Old Testament, they're all about the rebuilding of the temple. Now you might recall the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is sent back not to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah is sent back to rebuild the walls of the city to protect the people. Now, how does this all connect to Esther? You say, whoa, that was a flyover. That's intense. I'm not going to remember any of it. That's why we record it for you. So, Ezra chapter 2 says this. Right? I want you to see how God's hand is in all this. In Ezra chapter 2, only about 50,000, just under 50,000 people return to Jerusalem. Cyrus opens the doors. He says, you need to go back. You need to build it. And they say, I'm kind of comfortable here. I don't want to go back. So only just under 50,000 people actually go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And over 1 million people stay in the Persian Empire under the hand of Cyrus. Over 1 million Jewish people living in disobedience to God in the Persian Empire. Even though God had said, and they all knew that after 70 years, they were to go back. They were too comfortable. They said, it's pretty good here. So there's 1 million-ish disobedient people, Jewish people staying in Persia. This is the context of the book of Esther. So Esther is written in Persia. It's not written in Jerusalem. Esther is written to a disobedient people who didn't obey God to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Even though God had opened the door and given everything that they wanted, they needed to rebuild and everything that they would ever need. And they decided that they would be disobedient to God and they would stay in Persia. Esther's written to a disobedient people in a disobedient land, a pagan land of Persia, to a bunch of expats who chose comfort over obedience to God. And yet, even in their disobedience to God, their outright disobedience to God, it wasn't like they didn't know this is what God wanted. They actually said to God, get off my grass. Don't step on my vineyard. I'm comfortable here. And even in their disobedience, God's providence is at play by every move, guiding the game skillfully, even using the opponent's match, or the opponent's moves to win the match, as we're going to see in this book. Now, after Cyrus, the founder of the Persian Empire, dies, his son takes over, and then Darius takes over from him. That's his son Darius, and then Xerxes, or Ahasuerus. This is the context of Esther chapter 1. So it was King Xerxes that ruled at the time of Esther. Now, God gave Cyrus a soft heart. God did something in Cyrus's heart to allow the people to go back. Now, what we need to understand, there's a big difference between Cyrus and Xerxes. Xerxes was a tyrant of a king. He was impulsive, he was harsh, he was a sexual deviant, and he lived pridefully to show off his extravagance. So throughout Esther, there's 9 banquets that we're going to encounter, and every banquet is a complete debauchery. Complete debauchery. So ancient historians like Herodotus and extra-biblical writers have written a lot about Xerxes as king. And there's a particular story where Xerxes had his engineers create a bridge to go over some water, and a big storm came, and the water and the bridge got damaged and broke up or whatever. Well, Xerxes said, okay, can I have all the engineers come? And he killed them all. So engineers, you got a very important job. Right? So, this is the kind of king. He was impulsive, and he was kind of a tyrant. And the Jewish people decided that that's where they wanted to live. They wanted to live under the hand of this tyrant rather than go where God had called them to go. This is the biblical context of Esther. This is how Esther fits in to the larger biblical narrative. And we see that. Esther's not just some isolated story. Esther is a story about a dark, disobedient time for God's people. Now, what's happening in Esther is that God is preserving his people. Not because they deserve it. They're disobedient. But he's doing this because it's through these people, that the Messiah is to come. Now, what we see in the first verses of this chapter is just this prideful arrogance of King Xerxes. He's trying to project his power. And oftentimes, kings would do this in biblical times. They would project power through extravagance. So other nations would be like, wow, that's kind of... Those are visible pictures of power, and it would be a deterrent for other nations to try to attack. So the scene is set for us. So for 6 months, the king displays his vast wealth in his kingdom, and he wants you to see it. The book of Esther opens in such a way that we are drawn into the splendor and the glory of the king's majesty. It's a visible, impressive affair. In fact, nowhere else in the Bible outside of the temple and the building of the temple do you see such details around the splendor of such a thing. It says, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him. And while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days, wow, 180 days party for all the A-listers in the Persian Empire. This is what's happening here. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, which is like the capital city of Susa, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. The second feast that went for 7 days was for the civil servants of his kingdom. Okay, so 180 days for the A-listers, 7 days for the civil servants working in the kingdom. Now, what comes next is this visual display. It's meant for us, as we read it, it's intentionally meant for us to be drawn into this sense of worship of the king. Okay? A kind of worship. It's this sort of visual wonder of like, wow, this is a big deal. This King Xerxes has a lot of power, and he rules this huge empire in the world. And we're to be sort of in awe of the opulence and the lavishness of this king and how amazing these parties were and how wealthy he is. There are white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of whatever that is, marble, mother of pearl, precious stones. I mean, you get the idea here. That's over the top, isn't it? And drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds. The royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. It just flowed. This is going to be a party, you know what I'm saying? 180 days. And over the years, archaeologists have found and recovered a whole variety of these items that were used in the royal palaces of Persia. Let me show you a few things. This here is actually the footing for the palace in Persia. Right? It still remains today. It's been dug up by archaeologists. This is the footing that was built for the palace that this party was taking place in. Here's some of the things that were found in the palaces of the Persian Empire. This is used. This was used at the table, and then you'll see the cups that they refer to here. This is the cup, kind of a wild-looking golden cup that they would drink at these parties. And I mean, you when you're holding one of those, you're kind of a big deal. You're kind of a big deal. And drinking according to this edict, there was no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. So each man could drink with no compulsion. If you want to drink till you don't know what's going on, you drink till you don't know what's going on. If you don't want to drink, then you don't drink. You just do whatever you want to do. Whatever makes you happy, you do. This is what this kingdom is all about. And beneath the glittering surface was this really fragile eagle, as we're going to see as we go through Esther. This king, although he projects this wealth and he projects this power, is actually a very insecure ruler. Have you ever noticed that culture often gives us this idea or this lie that freedom happens through indulgence? That if you really want to be free, you need to have this. But those things often lead to bondage, don't they? Well, now I have this, and this, and now I got to pay for it all. Right? So how is it that we so often make the mistake that think that excess is strength, and that, or make the mistake that, trade indulgence for joy? I was wrestling with this as I was thinking about this passage this week. And then in verse 9 it ends here. It says, Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. So the plot is about to thicken here. And this last verse here is what we're going to look at next week, but there's a tension that begins to rise. You have all this stuff that the king's doing, and yet on the side here you have Queen Vashti doing her own thing. And that's when the tension begins to get really thick as we move on here. Now, you, like me, you probably find yourself sometimes looking around the world, like I said, and just saying, God, where are you? God, where are you? I mean, trying to be faithful, but sometimes it seems like the wicked in the world get exalted and the righteous become oppressed. And, I could find myself saying, God, where are you? Where are you? I don't see you. I don't see good things happening at times. And it's easy to become discouraged, and it's easy for us to think that God is somehow absent or that he doesn't care. The main purpose of the book of Esther is to remind us that when it seems like God is absent, he is never absent and he's always working. As I walked you through that history, you could see, couldn't you? The chessboard pieces moving. Things were happening because God is working in history, and you see God working out those things for such a time as this. Now, as we work through the book of Esther, we're going to see that God is always working behind the scenes. He's always putting the right people in the right place at the right time. Even the small, everyday moments are part of his bigger plan. Nothing slips past him. Nothing happens without his permission. And even the hardest parts of our lives, he can use them for his good. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? Sometimes what we do is we try to interpret life based on how things affect us in the moment. Now, as we walk through that history, you could find yourself, there's many moments where the people would have thought, what is happening? Where are you, God? And we do that, I think, more than anyone. We look at life and we base it on how things affect us in the moment. But that's not how God's people are called to think. What's interesting is when you look at the Bible, God's people, God wanted his people to think like this. They saw and understood life not as me, mine, and now, but they saw it as we, ours, and over generations. We, ours, and over generations. They trusted God across time, even when they couldn't see the outcome. We become so familiar with an instant everything. You just throw it in the microwave, right? We get instant. So we pray, God, we want an instant answer. God, yeah, we didn't get what we want right away, so God, you must not be there. We live in this fast-paced world that expects these instant answers, but God works in deeper and slower and wiser ways, and some of his promises won't be fulfilled in our lifetime. But we trust him because he's a covenant-keeping God, and he's still drawing people in, and he's still at work even when we can't see it. So even if your life feels chaotic and you look around and you say, God, why do you seem so silent? Where are you? You need to know, friends, not just in your head, but in your heart, he still sits on his throne. He still sits on his throne. And because he sits on his throne, we can trust him, we can rejoice in our salvation, and we can believe that he has dealt bountifully with us. So this is where Esther begins. A story where God moves behind the scenes, using even like unbelievably ungodly people in an unbelievably ungodly culture to accomplish his good and perfect purposes. The providential hand of God is always, always at work. You know, we're going to sing the next song, and I want to pray for us. And let me just pray. Father, thank you for this time. And I pray, Lord, that as we enter into this series this morning, that we'll understand that this whole book is about you revealing that even when it seems like you're distant, you're actually not. You're actually at work all the time. Help us to understand, Lord, your sovereignty. Yes, you rule over all things, but also to see your hand of providence working out your sovereignty in the world. And as we looked over many hundreds of years historically, that's what we see in that picture. That you are moving the pieces around the board because ultimately our Savior is going to come through this line. And I pray, Jesus, that as we go through this series, you would open our hearts and our minds to what you want to teach us. And we just thank you for this time. In your name I pray. Amen.